First item of business is the adoption of the agenda. Is there any changes or additions to the agenda? Trustee Doman is moving the agenda. Trustee DeGroot is seconding. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. The minutes of January 26th, Board of Education Business Committee is there before you. Are there any amendments to those minutes? Anybody like to move the adoption? Trustee DeGroot and Trustee Smith, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Action list. Mr. Secretary.
Before you is the BEBC action list. You see we've taken a few items off at the last meeting and at the advisory meeting. Last couple of items, I'm not sure if Superintendent Rod Allen isn't here today to comment on, but we're bringing forward the audit of education of Aboriginal students in BC Public School System at this meeting.
Thank you. And the board governance examination is on the 30th. Any questions of the Secretary at this time? Seeing none, moving on to no petitions and delegations. Education. Assistant Superintendent, want to introduce our guest?
Yes, so I'd like to introduce Ted Cadwallader. He's the Provincial Director for Aboriginal Education, and he's going to give us some information on the auditor's report for Aboriginal students in the BC Public School System. Thank you, Ted.
Welcome, Ted.
Thank you.
You've been here before with us.
No. It's we should mention that it's interesting to be here in this role too, because though I've been around across the province doing this same thing, this is the first time I've come back and talked here at home. So, in this role, so it's nice to be back. It's apprécié. Like I say, it's nice to be back and welcome in territory, welcoming and speaking people. And for this opportunity to talk to you about the Office of the Auditor General's report. They did an audit over the last year on Aboriginal education. Oh, I should introduce myself. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I'm Provincial Director for Aboriginal Education, as Cheryl said. So the Auditor General's team came to us quite some time ago, and they were considering Aboriginal education and the Ministry's role in Aboriginal education over the last number of years, and decided that they would conduct an official audit on that. They released their report in November of 2015, and the scope of the audit was contained to whether the Ministry had taken initiative to close the gap, and that was the wording used, close the gap in Aboriginal student achievement in the province of British Columbia. The wording for that came originally from the new relationship accord that the province had signed in 2006 with First Nations and Aboriginal people in British Columbia. And it was on the heels of the Kelowna Accord at that time. And when we first sat down with them to discuss this, we had chatted about their concepts of what the education system looked like in British Columbia, and we had let them know that it's a co-governance model that we use with boards, and you'll have seen reference to that if you had a chance to read the report about that co-governance model and some of the strengths of it, but also some of the challenges that have led to some parts of Aboriginal education through their view of not being acted upon by either boards or the Ministry of Education.
Can I interrupt? Are you saying this was the first look at the education system by the Auditor General?
No, it's the first that they looked at the Ministry's role in closing the gap in Aboriginal education. The Auditor General has done audits on other aspects of education, special needs being one of them, But this is the first time that they looked at Aboriginal education. The presentation that I'm going to use with you today is the same one that our Deputy Minister used to the Select Standing Committee on Public Accounts about a week and a half ago. Yeah. So some of the things you'll see in there will look through the lens of the ministry on how they saw the report. But I would encourage you, if you haven't done so, to read the Auditor General's report so that you can see exactly what it is that they say and exactly what the ministry has replied to the 11 recommendations. So the ministry has a responsibility, of course, to Aboriginal students as well as their parents and families, communities, to help improve the results and look to continue those increases in completion rates, better celebrate successes, and an obligation that the minister and the ministry take very seriously, particularly our Deputy Minister at the moment, Dave Bing, has placed a very high priority on Aboriginal education.
Ted, can I interrupt again and apologize? Could you put that on full screen for us?
Oh, yes. I'm looking at it here thinking it is full screen. Not from the beginning. I'm at that stage now where I
At the very bottom, right above the microphone or the speaker.
So I got my glasses on, I can see you, Rob. If I have my glasses on, I cannot see the screen. Slides are in view. What do you want to do, under view? Sure. Hit the window.
It's under slideshow.
It's under slideshow, basically. There we go. There we go. And we'll just see through this. That's okay. How's that look? Do you see something different than me? Sorry, no, I know. It was in slideshow. You see that split screen up there? Oh, it's off. No, I'll see if I can. And now- No.
You can't touch that. See that speaker right before the word English? There's a speaker, and just above it, there's a full screen symbol. No, the other way, Right there.
That
Oh
one.
my goodness, you're still split screen.
We're trying to-
Moving on.
No, we can see.
Thanks. That's part we didn't test it.
I know, we tested up to here.
When the 11 recommendations came back to us, all of them aligned with where the ministry wanted to go with Aboriginal education. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share some of those with you today. We expect that the work that we take on as a ministry and with boards of education across the province will result in an education system that is better for Aboriginal students across the province, but also I think it'll be better for all students. I mentioned too that it being a high priority, Aboriginal education at the ministry, also the 11 recommendations aligned with the directions that we wanted to come forward with out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. There were 92 recommendations from the TRC, some of them specific to education, some of them specific to federal legislation and federal responsibilities around education, but most of them were things that through our education lens we felt that we could take action on around Indigenous languages, around curriculum, around information specific to the residential school system. Some of the things that the ministry had done right off the gate was designate a year this year, a non-instructional day this year specific to Aboriginal education. Minister Fassbender announced that last June 19th. As often occurs, far later in the day than would be beneficial for planning in school districts. However, I've had the opportunity to go to a number of school districts this year and participate in those days, and I think that they've been. I've thought they've been very effective in helping our system move forward and helping it broaden the responsibility for Aboriginal students when we've been there. I was up in Williams Lake to start the year. First day of school was their non-instructional day. I was there with Maury Dockendorf to talk about curriculum implementation and how to do that through an Aboriginal worldviews and perspectives lens. I was in Vancouver Island North with a number of other keynote speakers and workshop presenters, and most recently up in Invermere to do that with Rocky Mountain School District. And I think the next one tentatively is New Westminster, April 11th. When we have had our discussions with the Auditor General's officers along this trial, along this journey with them, they also recognize that we have closed the gap in Aboriginal education. Expressed to them our data. When we first started really paying attention to this in the mid to late 90s, we were in the high 30s of a 6-year dogwood completion rate. As of last year, provincially, we were 63% dogwood completion rate. So the gap has narrowed, and I also expressed to the Auditor General's office that we're the highest performing educational jurisdiction in the world around Aboriginal education success. Still not great. Highest performing of a collective lot, right? So, Ministry of Education, we believe that we're on the right track. We believe that the work that we're doing with boards of education is being successful. We believe the work we're taking on with Aboriginal communities, First Nations organizations, is having an impact to create an environment across the province where we're working in a collaborative nature. When we look through the Auditor General's report at the 11 recommendations, 5 theme areas pop up. One is their request for a provincial strategy. There are a number of recommendations around accountability. There are a number of recommendations, again, around how we use data and how we use data to drive our actions, how we evaluate the effectiveness of our strategies, and how we provide support to school districts to improve results, and provide support to school districts in all of those other 4 areas. So I want to remind you that this was recommendations to the Ministry of Education, right? So I know that when I've had these conversations before, there's a trickle-out effect that people will say, well, we're already doing that. Well, that may be the case, but the Ministry of Education was not. It was boards of education and teachers and principals and district teams, and oftentimes community members as well. So. The one that they said right off the top is that the Ministry of Education needs to develop a system-wide strategy with accountabilities built into that. So our actions will be at the Ministry of Education to create that high-level system-wide strategy, to build in those indicators of success, and we've started that work already. We expect that over the next 6 to 8 months, the ministry will have procured, is that our ministry word? Procured the person or team to put together that strategy. And that will, of course, how we develop our, I won't even say of course, if it's done correctly and if it's done properly, it will be done in conjunction with all of us. And we'll all have a contributing piece to that to ensure that it reflects our whole system. Any questions on that one?
I have the first question. So that means when this whole initiative was launched in 2005 to dramatically increase the graduation rate by 2015, it wasn't accompanied with a strategic plan?
Correct.
And so then it begs the question, without that strategic plan, how did the province determine funding allocations?
Well, the funding allocations you'll be familiar with, right? Because it has changed over the course of time to the funding model that you've been challenged with putting in place over a number of years. Targeted funding, at that time, our Director Brian Donnelly, as he was getting ready to retire, had targeted funding put in place, the last piece of targeted funding that boards, that was targeted for boards to use. But no, there was no mandate from the Premier's office to the Ministry of Education to say, thou shalt put in place a strategic plan to improve these results. It was, and this is me looking back on it, it was put into the hands of Aboriginal Education Department at the Ministry of Education to try and do what they were going to do. And so that was one of the observations that the Auditor General had, was it can't be the Aboriginal Education Department, it has to be the Ministry of Education, so it requires a strategic plan, or else it's just going to sit on the shoulders of an Aboriginal Education Department to try to move an entire system.
Any other questions at this time?
In the area of accountability, recommendations 3 and 5 from the report ask the ministry to take action when results are not achieved, and to ensure that Evergreen or school leaving certificates were used appropriately. So what the ministry does is, what we do is take information from school districts on student success, put it onto SharePoints here at your school district. We'll have a SharePoint with unmasked data, provide reports out in November about provincial Aboriginal student achievement data, and also put public schools data on a public website that will be masked if the numbers are under 9. We've also embarked on creating a new accountability framework that's we call the Framework for Enhancing Student Learning, led by a director at the Ministry of Education, working with boards of education, principals, superintendents, associate superintendents, and I expect that our director will be in Tofino this weekend with the Vancouver Island Superintendents Association meeting to have that same discussion. We also limited the use of school leaving certificates, and there would have been an email out to all superintendents talking about the change in the ministerial credentials order with direction to review the policy that sits in districts to ensure that both of them align, so that a student who's on a path to an Evergreen has a special needs designation and is on an IEP. One of the things that the Auditor General also asked was structure so that we can share effective practices. So our Aboriginal Education Department hosts 2 meetings. One was in October, one will be in April in Richmond, where the school districts come together to talk about the things that they're facing, things that they're doing so that they can find success in changing what they're doing. And most recently, we focused those on a document called Aboriginal Worldviews and Perspectives in the Classroom, Moving Forward. And last was what we're doing at a district level. This meeting coming up in April, we will have people who are at a classroom level talking about what it is that they're doing to change their teaching practice, to bring Aboriginal expertise into the classroom. And I love those stories the most, right? I love how I looked at one this morning. It was a blog post from Invermere, from Rocky Mountain School District. It's about a teacher implementing Social Studies 9 and the change in her practice. And I got to talk to a teacher from Reynolds in Victoria and the students that he's working with, and the changes that he's seeing in his students and in himself as he brings this content to the classroom. Sometimes like a wild message. Data-driven decisions was a big part of what the Auditor General looked at. What they saw was that the ministry collected data and reported out on data, but they but we didn't do a lot of analysis of that data. And so the recommendations were collaborate with boards of education, superintendents, and Aboriginal leaders and communities to define and implement standardized monitoring and assessment of key indicators of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students' progress at key stages throughout their school career, among other things. So the actions that the ministry has committed to, again, is the development of the framework for enhancing student learning. We haven't landed on what those key indicators are because they might be different in your school district than they would be in other school districts. And I'll give you an example. Richmond School District has about 20,000 students, and about 300 of those are students of Aboriginal ancestry. So the way that they're going about changing their school district would be different than if the majority of your students, like Central Coast, the majority of the students are Aboriginal students there, and their total number of students is about 300 students. So they would have different indicators, potentially. So the idea in collaboratively developing the framework for enhancing student learning is to land on some indicators that will tell the ministry what they need to know to assess whether we're making a difference and closing the gap, but also help school districts and the school system itself understand whether those, whether we're moving things forward and whether we are improving results. So again, we haven't landed on those key indicators, and that discussion continues. The intent is to have the framework implemented September 2016. It's a challenge, I think, in a collaborative venture to put concrete timelines on whether you're going to land there, but I think it helps us to put those types of deadlines on it to push us to come to some sort of resolution. Ministry will have to go back to the Auditor General and perhaps the Select Standing Committee to give them updates on the implementation of the 11 recommendations. So there will be some action on them, and there will be a report out on them as well.
So Ted, in this year's provincial budget, is there designated money for this? I mean, if they're going to implement a framework, which hasn't been created yet, but if the goal is to start rolling this out in September, they have to be putting some dollars behind it, are they not? Or is that yet to be seen in the budget discussions?
Where says the $131?
So the budget speech was done last week, this week, Tuesday. And the budget process is that, of course, the budget speech will be made, and it will be at a level at which we see. Ministry of Education will go through our budget processes, and the division that's tasked with the implementation of the framework, I'm not sure what budget requests that they will put forward, but the Ministry of Education will be allocated funding from the throne speech and from the budget speech, and it will be each division's responsibility then to put forward the funding that they think they'll need to undertake things that we've committed to. But because this has been a commitment, I would expect that the Knowledge Management Division there will have put some funding around that. There has been no mention to me, nor was there in the budget speech, of funding that would be going out to the system to support the framework specifically, but that doesn't mean that that's not the case. An evaluation, recommendations 4 and 11 in the Auditor General's were around evaluation. Again, they said that the ministry provides information, but they don't analyze it and they don't evaluate the weight of it. So specifically, they looked to evaluate the impact of targeted funding, evaluate the impact of enhancement agreements, that there would be expectations for regular provincial and district reporting, and a report on the progress of the effectiveness of all strategies that we use to improve results, or in their terms, close the gap for Aboriginal education. So to that recommendation, we've had already implemented a review of enhancement agreements. I'm not sure if that request has come from our researchers to the school district, but they had selected 22 school districts across the province as part of their review, some of them on Vancouver Island, but geographically spread equally around the province. That's underway now with the expectation that in April we'll have that report, although there's been some delays, so it might be later than April that we get the report back from our researchers. We also look at student achievement data, mostly from Aboriginal education's end of things through our enhancement agreement coordinator, Colleen Hanna. Colleen has a great skill set in analysis of data, working specifically with school districts around what it is that they're seeing with their own data. But being one person for enhancement agreements, and I use her for data analysis as well, that proves that we're pretty thin on the ground. But our recommendations from the Auditor General is that we build that into what we do at the Ministry of Education. So that will, of course, I won't even say of course again, but that would require staffing in our data analysis unit, but also data analysis support to the development of the framework for enhancing student learning. And in discussions with the director there, that's what he's looking forward to too, is having a team that's dedicated to supporting Aboriginal student success within school districts, that we can work with school districts, including on data analysis. And district support. Auditor General said to support, collaborate with boards of education, superintendents, and Aboriginal leaders and communities to provide all students, well, that's 2 and 5, 2 and 6. Provide support to boards of education and superintendents to ensure they have the capacity to achieve results. Which I applauded when they put it in there. Thank you. What that looks like at the moment is that sharing of effective practices, meetings that we have to talk either individually with school districts or with regional meetings with school districts or provincial meetings with school districts to talk about effective practices and what they're learning. The development of a new resource, Aboriginal Worldviews and Perspectives in the Classroom, that will be supported by, I was thinking that our video support for that should be up on our web. It was supposed to be up last Friday, but we'll see if it comes up this week. But also building Aboriginal worldviews and perspectives into the curriculum. What we're also have underway at the moment is a review, is a research project to look at how we would develop a province-wide anti-racism strategy. So that research project will give us information that should inform the development of a provincial anti-racism strategy. We expect that at this point it will be aligned with or part of the Erase strategy across the province, but without the report coming back yet and seeing what those recommendations are, it going to the Deputy Minister for approval and then us getting permission to build a plan for that. I don't want to speculate on what might come out of that. The Ministry also talked to the Auditor Generals about the non-instructional day as a method of support, and the discussions around the development of the 10 through 12 graduation years on how we might do what had happened in the K-9 session with Aboriginal content integrated, that the same expectations would be for the 10 to 12. As you can see from the report, nothing specific there that says, okay, this is again, as from a budget perspective, funding to go out the door to boards of education to do that at the school district level. And I wanted to share this picture with you too. Some of you might have it, recognize where that is. From our, I think we're at a very good place. I think in province British Columbia, around Aboriginal education, we haven't been at a place as positive as this, with the potential to really make a difference. It's the first time that, and I started teaching in 1983. It's the first time that I've ever been involved in a chance to change the education system. And so I know that many of you were teachers too, right? And you didn't have that opportunity. So I look at it as potential in front of us and possibilities in front of us through the lens of Aboriginal education to change our system so that when our students arrive to us, they come to a system that they're very familiar with, that they're welcomed into, and they have as equal a chance to be successful in school as anybody else. And I mentioned at the meeting I was at earlier on Friday that the reason that kids would not be successful is because they didn't do the work, not because they're First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. So I think that we're at a place where we can build a system just like that, and I think we're well on the way to doing that. When I look at what's going on around the province, from individual teachers, from schools, principals, community members, entire districts, boards of education, I think there's an awareness of what needs to be done. I think there's a challenge in front of us because even though we know what needs to be done, we're often constrained by all sorts of pressures, cost pressures, budgetary pressures, political pressures, but there's still avenues through that. And as I say, I think we're in a good spot, but I'm also a realist too. So from Ministry of Education's perspective, I think, well, from where I sit in the 4th floor learning division at 620 Superior Street, that there's a willingness to try to make a difference. And I'm not the only one there doing that, right? It doesn't just rest on my shoulders or my 5 staff members' shoulders to change the system. I think there's I think there's a big will there to make a difference. And I would also say that a large part of that comes from your superintendent when he was there. Because he, with our learning division, tasked all of the directors there to bring Aboriginal education to everybody, not just for Aboriginal students. And that meant curriculum and special needs, distance learning, assessment, reporting, to everybody there. And they thought about it and then took on what he'd also told us when he was there. What interests my boss should fascinate the hell out of me. And so we became fascinated with it, what interested him. So,
so were we.
That picture, we went with a group of students here who were at Seavolk at the time, with Albie Charlie from Cochin, a number of other folks, and went up and stood on that point, and that's the Narrows to the left, and that's the entrance to Cochin Bay, just down around that point, where the Thunderbird pulled the whale out of the way to allow the food to come into the people. And so Albie talked about that when we were up there, and that was pretty cool to see that young lady standing there looking down at that point. And I just thought that yeah, she's comfortable standing on Cowichan territory, understands the stories that are from that place, but there's a whole open world out there in front of her to take advantage of, and I think that's where we're at provincially.
Thanks, Ted. I have a couple of questions before I turn it over to the other trustees. In the report, it speaks to a number of First Nations in British Columbia are educated on reserves, especially in the primary elementary schools. But that's under federal jurisdiction in terms of funding and oversight.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have counterparts in that department that you, I mean, would they be involved in developing a strategic plan that benefits all children? Because a lot of those children would enter our secondary schools.
That's a good question, and the answer to the first question is yes, I do have counterparts there. We have a tripartite education framework agreement with the federal government First Nations, as represented by the First Nations Education Steering Committee, and Province of BC. There was to be an oversight committee meeting of that tomorrow, but it's been postponed. So I do have colleagues there. We work quite closely with First Nations School Association on a number of things because we have obligations within that agreement to work with them. However, we don't provide any oversight to that system. We don't require any data from that system unless it's handed to us as part of a report out on that system and shared with us and with our federal colleagues. So the development, the audit itself, its scope was contained to public schools. So the development of the plan may include at a peripheral level an understanding of that system and how it might be informed, and it would also be informed by First Nations who operate those schools too, because those students do come to our schools on the most part. There's about 15,000 First Nations status on reserve students in the province. About 8 or 9,000 attend public and independent schools, and about 6,000 attend First Nations operated schools. But most of those 6,000 will at some point transition into our public or independent schools. So it would be incumbent upon us, I think, to keep that in consideration in the development of a plan.
Any other questions, trustees? Trustees Pillsbury.
Can I just ask around the provincial identification of strategies that school districts are using and sharing, which I love that idea because I don't know about all other school districts, but certainly ours continues to work as hard as that can on raising the student success of Aboriginal kids and all kids. In your work throughout the province and maybe the work on that identification, have you run into particular school districts that we should be looking at for models or particular ideas? I mean, as you know, I sit on the provincial Aboriginal, and you know, certain ideas come up from certain districts that are doing well. Are there ideas for us to research?
So there are characteristics that I see of school districts that are continually increasing their results, and also changing how they go about doing what they're doing. So I would say one of the most common characteristics is the presence, both personally and vocally, in Aboriginal education of the leaders of the school district. So asking those questions, again, if it's important to you as a board, then it's important to everybody out there. Right? So I would just say that the vocal and personal presence there to say, how are our students doing? And to ask good questions. Specific strategies. One of the things that we've seen when we've analyzed data is that our graduation rate, though it's increased for Aboriginal students from 39 to 63%, the trajectory for First Nation status students is not that. It's about 50%. So First Nation status students about 50%, where Aboriginal students 63%, all students in the 82% range, right? So if you analyze your data and you look at First Nation status students, and those are the strategies, that's the demographic that you want to look at, because that's the demographic that I'm looking at now from a provincial perspective, is how do I improve the results for those students? Then you start to narrow your focus, and if you can improve the results for those students, then you improve the results for everybody. Some specific things that have happened at school level that I've seen in 3 different districts that have had really impressive results are people who are at those schools who have the specific responsibility as a grad coach to move those kids from grade 8 through to grade 12 and graduate with a dogwood. So that there's somebody there all the time who has the authority to do what needs to be done. So not resting on the shoulders of a language instructor a support staff there, right? So they're there to coach students, to coach teachers, to make sure that all those things line up. I know from my own experience, being intimately involved in the education system, it is really hard to be intimately involved in your sons and daughters move from grade 8 to grade 12 and knowing what has to happen. So even with me, knowing all that, it's still a challenge, right? So you can imagine not knowing anything about a trial by credits from grade 10 to grade 12, right? And what that means, and whether you're on a path to a dogwood or whether you're on a path to an evergreen. A parent might learn that for the first time after the graduation ceremony, right? And not even know what that means. So if we can have people, and I've seen graduation rates jump dramatically in Peace River South. The year before last was See the Sky, but that was it. And I'll also talk about the courage to have tough conversations around Indigenous language. This one was around Indigenous language. The leadership and with the advisory had decided that Indigenous language in this school district, School District X, was vital. It was really important, and it needed to not just be for First Nations kids, it needed to be for all kids. So the superintendent committed to that conversation with the school where this was going to happen. And she said it was hard. And she said people were afraid, and the fear came out as anger and resistance, but it was fear. And she honored that. She said, I know you're afraid. Your students will still do fine. Your children will still do fine in numeracy and literacy, and they'll learn how to speak Slashdom. And we're doing it. But I understand that you're afraid. And we'll continue to have these conversations, and we'll continue to monitor, but we're still doing it. But she also had the backing of the board to be able to have that hard conversation, because the moment that slips, then nobody will want to have that conversation again. So I would say those are the characteristics, is strong presence of leadership, strategies to help students get from grade 8 through to a dogwood, and courage to have those tough conversations. The reason that we have an anti-racism research project going on is because there's racism, right? And it's built into our system in many cases, and I experienced that at the Ministry of Education, and I have those hard conversations too, to say, does this policy benefit the system, and does it provide obstacles to a person because they're Aboriginal, right? It works for everybody. Those kids should fit in. So investigating what it is that we do as a system, because we acknowledge that we have systemic racism. Well, if we acknowledge it, then let's take some action around it. So, and those are the hard conversations that we'll have to have, I think, as a society. To say, are we really the people that we keep saying we are? And if we want to become those people, then let's change how we go about doing things.
Thank you, Jen. Any other questions? Ed, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share the story with us, and hopefully we'll see you before the end of the year with the newly written strategic plan. And
Well, if you're not part of having written the plan, I hope that we're not the first time you see it. We'll see how that unfolds. But thanks for that opportunity.
thank you. In a not so cheerful note, I'd like to ask Secretary Tricia.
Nice.
Thank you.
Cheerfully.
The 2016-2017 annual budget preview report was prepared as part of the board's communication strategy on budgets to get information out to the public as it becomes available to us. It's not intended to represent our final budget position. It is a preview of what we know now. There will certainly be more estimates to come as we work towards our March date. But it's a chance to talk about some of the items that we are aware of various scales. There are some big numbers here and some small numbers here, and there are some items that are missing, and they're very much, we're still in the estimate phase. So I just want to emphasize this isn't our final budget position. That will come later. The report following this meeting will be posted to our website and become publicly available that way. It is through the BEBC agenda, should somebody wish to find it that way, but it will be front and center for people to see as well. So we begin with an introduction section of the report where it just outlined the board's legislative requirements around passing a balanced budget, that the budget needs to be filed on or before June 30th, 2016. But for us, realistically, it needs to be filed or needs to be adopted by the first board meeting in May so we can execute it in a timely manner. There are a number of things that the board is currently doing to plan for the next school year, and that is around setting the priorities for the delivery of student learning. That you could consider that to be your strategic plan development. We projected student enrollment. That has been concluded, and I'll talk about that in the report. We're in the process of projecting our costs, of rolling our existing services forward to the next year. We know there are cost pressures in the areas of salaries and benefits, utilities. Inflation comes into there as well. Determining how our enrollment change will affect our programs. We've taken the enrollment that we estimated and run it through the ministry's grant estimator, and we'll talk about that in a little bit here as well. We'll then move, after this phase, move into identifying strategies to address the budget shortfall, and then do a final review of the budget against the board's planning and finalize decisions on the budget. So we start out with a section here on expenditures. And I'm not going to read it line for line, but I want to go through each one of the items for you. And if you want to stop and talk about any of them, please do. The first section is funded. So what we know is that next year our CUPE and USW employees are entitled to a 0.5% salary increase on July 1st. And that'll be followed by another 1% plus a potential economic stability dividend on May 1st, 2017. So we do understand there's a commitment from the ministry to fund those increases, so there isn't a dollar amount here with the pressure. So I haven't brought in any revenue on this report, and I haven't brought in an expenditure. We're hoping that they match. We'll find out.
Sorry. How's these students?
Is that going to show up in the form of the block funding under the per pupil?
It likely will.
And when do we find out?
Before March 15th.
And why would we, if you're in this process now, why would we know?
We have built in the expenditure into our budget document behind this, but we haven't seen how the ministry is going to run the calculations to see if those are a match yet on the revenue side. We know what the expenses are. There should be a match in revenue for that. We'll incorporate that into our final budget document, but if it's net neutral, I haven't included it on this report as a pressure leading to a bottom line shortfall. The second item is around teacher wage increases. They'll receive 1% on September 1st, or really July 1st. Also entitled to a potential increase on May 1st through the economic stability dividend, should there be one. This year it was 0.45%, and will roll out on May 1st, 2016, and will be funded. So those two items are on here just to make you aware that they are going to increase the overall budget, but we are expecting funding to match those, so we aren't putting them on as a cost pressure.
Sorry. So, are we going to see that being in funding protection still?
We did this year. So they did calculate the employee wage increases outside of funding protection.
Okay.
Set it to the side in this year's funding, and expect the same would be true for next year.
Okay.
Otherwise, districts in funding protection have no capacity to fund their wage increases.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
It's anticipated. I can't guarantee the funding formula, but that's if it follows this year's pattern. That's what we'll see.
Okay.
Under not funded, this year the principals, vice principals group were permitted to have a compensation increase. We don't know if there'll be one next year, but I just put a number in there. Should it be 2%, it would cost approximately $135,000. Not to be funded by the Ministry of Education.
And why not?
they've only committed to funding the provincially negotiated support staff and teacher contracts.
But is that not subject to this budget discussion of the provincial budget, or are they just, it's not even on the table this year?
They haven't put any money into the provincial budget for negotiated settlements. The district's average teacher salary cost. So this is common. Every year our teachers move up through the increments, and that this year when we ran our teachers, moving them up a grid for if you go up a year, you go up in pay raise. If you go up in education, you move from one grid to another grid. The estimate of that is $409,000. That's consistent with other years. Should we see a large number of retirements, that'll offset some of the additional costs because we'll have some higher end teachers going out, but we don't know that at this point yet. So we're starting with just the increment pressure. Medical services plan premium. For January 1st, 2016, we saw an increase, and to take that increase now out over an entire year, that'll cost us $20,000. We know the province has announced some new premium rates based on income level, but we're not able to actually run that calculation yet, not knowing what those thresholds will be. So there could be some either positive or negative effects still to come on medical services plan, and we'll hopefully have that finalized in the next month here. BC Hydro has announced a rate increase of 4%. That was effective April 1st, 2015 is right. April 1st, 2015. And so that rate will continue on into the 16-17 budget and then increase again by $24,000, or sort of increase again by 3.5% on April 1st of this year. So there's a cost pressure there through our hydro and utilities. The 2015-16 year was unique. It started really late. It started September 8th, and it concludes very early. So one of the budget savings we were able to bring into the 15-16 budget was that we were going to have a shorter year for which we would be paying for our support staff that work in the schools, particularly education assistants and clerical. We go back to a more traditional year. Next year, I need to restore that week to the budget. The savings was $250,000 this year, and that now needs to go in to reflect our more standard school calendar start and end dates. We'll get into enrollment a little bit later, but to maintain the same student-educator ratio as we currently have would cost $100,000. So I'm just saying if we don't make any reductions in staff as we are, there's going to be a need for another block of another classroom based on the enrollment numbers.
Can you remind me of the student-educator ratio that we are in this year?
Well, we try to start out at about 17.2. And it tends to fluctuate as we go through the year. If our enrollment drops, which it has in the past, we've often ended up with a better SCR than that. This year our enrollment grew and we staffed it, and I actually haven't run that specific calculation for where we ended up, but we did start at 17.2, and that's typically where we begin our budget process. So that's 17.2 students for every teacher. The final item here under cost pressures is that, and this was announced in the I think in the provincial budget, is that we will need to find provincially another $10.5 million to fund the Next Generation Network. So the Next Generation Network is basically the high bandwidth that's going into the community and into the schools. And we currently pay $244,000, which was that late announcement that happened after last year's budget. So in planning for this next increase, we represent about 1.5% of the province, and that would mean of $10.5 million, our share would be approximately $157,000 over and above the $244. So it's becoming very expensive to run technology in the schools. But with so many students arriving with their own devices, and sometimes 2 or 3, you might have a phone that's on the network, and an iPad that's on the network, and a laptop that's on the network. The need to keep up with that technology is really stressing the network infrastructure. And the province is passing those costs on to school districts. So under the savings section, I guess this is the good news part of this report, if I can say there is. Really significant reduction in in the employer's portion of the teacher pension plan premium this year, coming up. Very significant. It actually, we had to test this number a couple of times in a couple of different ways just to make sure that we believed it. So we believe that that rate reduction will save us about $650,000. So that's coming off the top, and we know that now, and we're telling you about that now. The other area that we're going to see is a reduction in is in the area of WorkSafe BC rates. So we do know that we have the worst rate in the province. However, rates, it is down from last year. It still continues to be the worst rate, but it's going to cost us less money to be the worst. So that's it. So when we add all those up, those pluses and minuses, we get to an expenditure pressure of $415,000 approximately. And we know that's not the end of the list. We will have more as we move ahead. We're just trying to start to communicate some of those issues. So the next section, because it leads into our funding estimate, is on student enrollment. And if I could draw your attention to the far left-hand column where it says K. Projecting quite an increase there. You can see that that's going up a fair bit over what our K was this year, which was around 519, but shows higher in ones because we're projecting students coming back into the district like we had this year, potentially over the summer. So as we move through, you can see that our grades are really kind of all over the place. It would level out a little bit if we went from 0 to 600 or 0 to 640 as far as the bumps, but we start this graph at 500, and we're not really consistent through our cohorts. There tend to be bumps, and there's a big hollow section there between 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. But the overall picture is that we are expecting our enrollment to go up by about 25 FTE from this year. So it's not a huge amount. We saw really strong enrollment in the K in the south end when we were doing our projections. And we think, again, like this year, that was where our big area of enrollment growth was, and particularly over the summer where we had our unexpected enrollment growth. So we've looked at that and thought that that's probably likely to happen again. We haven't projected 150 students arriving in the district, like as did unexpectedly this year. We split that in the middle and thought that based on the cohort that we had moving it ahead, we would add 75 for influx, to be conservative, and that's pretty consistent with what we usually see in any given year in elementary anyway. On the secondary level, we looked closely at transition rates from year to year, how many students we lose between 10 and 11 and 11 and 12, and we accounted for that, and we accounted for the course load that students take. So we think we have a pretty logical forecast, and it will show a small increase of 25 FTE. So the next chart here is really to look at our enrollment over the last number of years, starting in 2001, 2002. So you can see the slide, and you can see how it starts to level out here. Now 15, 16 is still here as an estimate because there are a February and May count which haven't been accounted for here yet. When this report was prepared, I didn't have that data. But you can see the leveling out now, where we've been on a constant decline, and we're now starting to level. And it's that leveling out that's causing the problem with the funding protection, because now we're coming out, we don't have the enrollment drops every year to keep driving us further into funding protection and save that revenue at 98.5% of the previous year. So I think that's a really interesting trend to see that we're now, as we predicted we would around this time, starting to now kind of level it out. Under the revenue section, the district receives about 96% of revenue from the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education determines that funding for us, and they use our enrollment estimates for that. And the estimates went in last week, and I've just described that we're up about 25, but we also have some other variations in that enrollment estimate as well. We'll get that funding announcement on or before March 15th, so it's coming pretty quickly. That'll tell us exactly what we're going to receive for this year. We did run the current formula, our estimate through the current formula to figure out if everything remained the same and the dollars were the same, and and our estimate was what we actually received in September. What is our funding formula? What is our funding going to be? Are we still in funding protection? And if we move to the next graph chart here, the red line represents what we should have received had we not been in funding protection, and the blue line is with funding protection. Now it drops off a bit between 15-16 and 16-17. You can kind of see it drops a little bit quicker. That's because we're no longer going to be receiving in 16-17 the BC Education Plan funding, and we're required to come up with another $300,000, which I'll get to later in this report, for the administrative savings. So those are factored in there. But what's important to look at here are the gaps, and the gap is now down to about $11,000 on funding protection should the enrollment roll through the formula the way we think it will, using the ministry's funding estimator. So that is close. So that basically means should be it. This next budget year should be the last year that we're in funding protection, unless something extreme happens with our enrollment that's not anticipated. So when we run that funding formula, we see that our enrollment is going to drop by, our funding is going to drop by just under $1 million. That's anticipated. That's that 1.5% that we're going to drop because we're not in, we're dropping at 1.5% of our prior year funding. It's approximately $1 million. That's that figure. The next item I bring forward, which is on the next page, is that for the second year, we're required to find a further $358,000 in administrative savings. So that gets taken off of our funding directly from the ministry. When you add those two items together, that'll show a grant drop of $1.3 million, just over $1.3 million. So the drop, because we're going to drop 1.5% of our funding because we're still in funding protection, but we're guaranteed 98.5% of the prior year. And the second part of that drop being we're having to find the additional administrative savings. Okay.
So I remember last year when they, for lack of a better word, sprung that on us. It was tempered a little bit because administrative savings had a very vast definition.
Mm-hmm.
Is that probably going to be the same this year? Or?
It's the same definition.
Okay.
It could be revenue growth. Say the international program grew, you could claim that, or your interest revenues grew, or you found a way for rental revenues to grow. Those are considered as administrative savings. It is also not just entirely function 4, which is our administrative function. It doesn't just mean administration in the sense that you might think. I think it broadens to even utilities and other areas. It's just specifically not supposed to hit the classroom. It's a very broad definition.
Thank you.
The next section. Oh,
So Jason, what do we have? Faced with increased hydro costs and also MSP costs, that 350 is actually, because those are administrative costs, right? So
yeah,
you're going to take away one hand, we're going to add to your costs the other hand.
that's right. The third item that is significant that makes up the projected net budget position is surplus. This year we balanced our budget using just under 1.7 million in unrestricted surplus, and we were lucky to have that going into September when we had all those students arrive.
Mm-hmm.
But had we not had that money in the bank, we would have had to have made reductions this year, close to $1.7 million. So really what this is telling us is these are reductions that would have happened in 15-16 and are now having to happen in 16-17 because we were lucky to have some money in the bank based on the job action and other situations, just this is the way the prior year rolled out, that we now have to find in 16-17. Now we have worked on a surplus projection for this year that will come to the board on March 1st. But it's certainly nowhere in the neighborhood of what we had here, but we will have a figure for you on March 1st as well. So, yeah. So to add that all up, If we look at the way we've gone through the report, we've talked about the estimated expenditure pressures and brought that number down at 415,575. We've talked about the estimated revenue reduction, drop 1.5% in revenue because we were coming out of funding protection. Use of the surplus this year that we're not expected to have. When you add those three items together, it comes up with a shortfall in the neighborhood of $3.4 million. Again, I don't want this to be the final budget reconciliation. This is a snapshot, which is getting information out early and try to define the scope and scale of what the challenge will be for the 16-17 budget. It won't be exactly that number. It could go up, it could go down. We're still working through that. So the next steps are the board will be required to approve this budget before June 30th, 2016. We will bring it to the board at the end of April for first and second reading, April 28th. So there's a lot of work to do between now and then. Hoping the final reading will occur on May 3rd to allow our staffing processes to take place. We'll have a public meeting on March 31st. At the same time, we'll release a survey and collect information from the public. And then there'll be a whole series of meetings in April as we work through this with our liaison groups and advisory group and back to the DEBC. And so, in conclusion, there's three big areas. We're seeing expenditure cost increases, revenue drop, and we balance the budget using a big pile of surplus that we won't have again. I want to emphasize that there definitely will be some difficult decisions to make around programs and service levels. We seek the public's input as we bring that information to the board for making those decisions. And I guess that concludes my report.
Trustee Smith?
I think this year is going to be an interesting budget year. And I know you talked about, this is not good news, but actually it's going to be an interesting exercise because what we put ourselves in for the 16-17 budget is now our real life budget from that point on because we're out of funding protection. The $1 million every year cut's no longer going to exist. You know, like this year's budget is actually really important to us when we get ready to shift because that is real life for this district from that point on. So I'd be really interesting, it'll be a really interesting budget process for me anyway, to watch how we get there because we are back into real dollars. I mean, back to when we did our first budget in 2000 and funding protection didn't exist and false spending didn't exist. You know, we're back to that now. So I think this is going to be a really interesting budget season because then we're going to stabilize. We'll be able to stabilize and then start to grow again, especially with our FTE if it's going to slowly rise. I mean, this will be our first real life budget. Okay, we're going to get there, and there's going to be some hard conversations. However, after this budget's done, that's when we plot our future because we don't have the threat of losing 1 point whatever million and. So I think it'll be a really interesting budget season.
Yeah, I do as well. I think it will be. There will be almost a restructuring, per se, of the budget. But looking ahead at our enrollment stabilization, it will be a difficult year, but it shouldn't be so difficult in the years following if the trends of now reaching a stabilized enrollment and being funded for the students that you actually have starts to continue on. But it will be a difficult year, for sure.
So, you keep your counterparts, I'm not sure if they're counterparts, but do you have communication with the ministry on this issue? Like, how is the ministry informed of the challenge, especially in number 1 and the second part of number 2? I totally agree with Trustee Smith regarding we've had a very gentle fall in terms of revenue through the funding protection, and number 3 is literally our responsibility in response to the increased enrollment this year. But the $400,000 and some odd of expended costs, pastures, and the $385,000, I believe it is, of administrative cost savings, that's $800,000 plus that is coming from a direction that we need to make a statement about. So do we communicate with our minister saying, this is what we're facing, just in case you're not aware of it?
At the provincial level, the BC Association of School Business Officials that represents Secretary Treasurer certainly does. They'll compile a report on the estimates across the province on all these areas and submit that collectively. So we haven't done it ourselves to say here's our pressures. The ministry is well aware of the administrative savings because they initiated that one, and we have filed a report, a 2-year report at the conclusion of last year's budget cycle. They're also aware of districts coming out of funding protection because they have the reports on that, so they know that that's occurring. And I think why it's so drastic this year for us is last year's budget started with almost $3 million in funding protection. This year's budget will start with almost 0 in funding protection, and we made up the difference by having the surplus to roll forward. So it's just the perfect storm of coming out rapidly rather than slowly. We're coming out very rapidly, and it's because of that unexpected growth that happened in September. If that hadn't happened, we'd be still well in funding protection, and certainly wouldn't. Well, what we would have is we wouldn't be seeing any additional funding coming in. We'd still be in funding protection, but we'd be educating less students. So we'd have a savings on the cost side of saying, well, we're going to have 100 fewer students. Therefore, we're not going to need as many teachers or education assistants, and you'd be able to show a bunch of savings that you can't right now. That's the difference.
And I think that if you look at minutes from BCSTA, there have been many letters written from the School Trustees Association. I was going to say complaining, but certainly pointing out that the low-hanging fruit doesn't exist, and that was a comment by the Premier, by the way, in case you're wondering. That extra administrative cost is a cut is huge, and for some districts like ours, we've already done all this cutting. I mean, there's some that they need to probably look at and say, hey, but we've done that, and it's really difficult to start cutting again, or still as the case may be.
I guess my concern is how do we ensure that, I appreciate it through the Secretary Treasurers Association that the communication is collectively done, but I'm not sure why we would not want to make a recommendation to the board to have our chair communicate to the districts. Because this is, as you said, a perfect storm, and I'm not sure if it's duplicated elsewhere because of the funding protection and increasing enrollment simultaneously, and it's unusual, isn't it? Or is this a pattern for people that are going out of funding protection?
Well, funding, everybody's supposed to eventually come out of funding protection. It's just how quickly. And provincially, and I don't think I can't imagine we're alone on this issue this year, because provincially there were 6,700 more students than anticipated across the province, which means a number of districts must also have, and it would be interesting to do the comparison between the funding protection level that was estimated in last March's estimate and what came back in September, just to see how far everybody did shift to coming out, because I imagine it'll be the same challenge for every one of those districts that had growth that also had funding protection. Funding protection is so much easier. Well, it helps you when you're declining and going down. It becomes difficult when you have to pay it back, which is where we're at.
Yeah. Yes, Trustee Smith?
I'd be cautious for this committee to send anything to the board right now, as this is just an estimate. If we're going to send the ministry figures, we should be sending them real figures, not estimate.
I was just, if there is a potential for a shift in the budget allocation in this year's spring budget, do we do it sooner or later? That's concern. Yes. Trustee Clark.
Thank you. I find it a bit bamboozling that you can sort of cut away at a budget and then have an expectation that it won't affect the classrooms. Because pretty much everything we do ends up in the classroom. So I know that's the rationale. Is the opposite rationale also provable? You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, every time we take $1 out of the system, we take it out of the classroom, because that's where all the dollars are aimed. Is there a logic to that?
To the question, or if they?
I'm trying to for the answer, but yeah, no, but can you look at it that way?
Can I clarify if you're talking about the administrative savings?
I'm talking about the administrative savings. I think that almost every suggestion from the ministry that comes about cuts says, you have to cut it, but don't cut it in the classrooms. Is that really true, or is that a little bit of a stretch?
Yes.
You're safer, you're safer.
Yeah, you got a recording going.
I don't know how to answer that. I think we always try, I think it's always the objective of boards to cut as far away as possible, but you're right, everybody is integrated into the success of students and the delivery of programs, no matter who you are. You can't really say that.
Yeah.
But yet we are required to find savings and say that this position is administrative in nature.
Okay.
I don't know.
I know, it's a tough one.
Trustee Spillier.
Can I just enter the conversation around this? And I think what it is everything is connected to that classroom. There's not a doubt in anybody's mind. The board's challenge is to identify of the things which will have the least impact. All of them will have impact. Which is the least impact on the classroom. So, welcome to the challenge.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, you know, I think that, everybody wants to live in a world where we're enhancing education, not doing our least worst. And that's sure a challenge. I think the least worst philosophy hasn't necessarily been shared with the ministry. I mean, we all say we can't exist without this, but I think, maybe more a statement of what we're doing within that realm is, as much as we try and enhance education, really a lot of our efforts go into doing least harm with the monies unavailable to us. Jason, this is 2 lines.
I have a question of the trustees that have come before us and perhaps staff. Have we faced the $3.4 million deficit in the past?
Yes. This is not rare.
The largest that I recall was 5.5. I'm going to say that was 2006-07 era.
That's a
Around
big
that. It was huge. That particular year, the prior year, the ministry had funded an increase for teacher wage increases. And then the year following, reversed the funding that they'd given us in the prior year, and we had to find the second year of funding for that year. So it was sort of a double, we had to find 2 years of teacher wage increases in 1 year without any funding. So we did have 1 year that was really significant. And there was certainly, if you look through the budget booklet that you should have, there should be one that you have that's bound, and you look at the SER, the student educator ratio, there's going to be one of the years that student educator ratio spikes from about 16.2-ish to 17.9. And I think that was probably the biggest challenge year. I'm not sure which year it was exactly, but you'll see it there. It stands out.
Thank you. Any other question, Mr. Sandquist? Any other business? Can we have a motion to adjourn then? Trustee Smith, Trustee Root, all those in favor? Opposed, motion carried. Thank you, everyone.